name is Cleo Bradford, born in Blanding, Utah, March 23, 1931. And I've enjoyed living where I'm at now to have the location where I was born 91 plus years ago, to where I can look at it and think, now, am I doing what I ought to be doing with the time I have left?
Can you explain a little bit about the start of the 1923 Posey War, how that all began with the sheriff?
The story that I've understood was that it resulted in a Mexican individual who had been herding sheep here, receiving payment, and then heading out to go to New Mexico, where he was from, had been raised there, and then had come here to herd sheep. But he was tracked by a Ute individual who took his life because he saw that he had some money and he was anxious to get rid of the sheep herder. That was a 1915 issue. And from there was kind of turmoil thereafter until when the 1923 thing was, again, there was two young Ute boys that was brought into the basement of the old elementary school where they held a court. And those two boys that had stolen some of the sheep herder stuff out there, they held a court in the basement of the school building. And during the lunch break, there evidently had been some pre-planning from some of the adult Ute. That just happened that the two Ute boys come out, and there was a couple of horses waiting there that they were able to handicap the sheriff a little bit as to where he wasn't able to control it. And they got on the horses and went out into Westwater. His gun, he pulled his gun to shoot, and it misfired. And then the one Ute boy got the gun and shot at him, and it misfired. And then as they were coming up, the sheriff was on his horse behind the two Ute boys on the horses they'd taken, and turned and shot. And that time the gun worked and shot the sheriff's horse.
After the trial went south, you can see exactly where Posey would have led his band, because this is the road, the old road, which leads over to Blanding, Utah. Just behind there is Bears Ears, and if we look over here, we can see a canyon that Posey and his band would hide out in. As far as I can tell, this is not Allen Canyon, but it's kind of the route which they took to make their getaway. Behind me is the location of one of the only engagements of the Posey War. After the two braves escaped from the town school, which they had stylized into a jail on March 20th, 1923, they made their way down here where Posey was waiting for them. Now, it would have been an easy rendezvous point. You have a canyon immediately over to my right, and there the sheriff pursued them on the back of his horse. Now, Posey apparently shot at the sheriff and managed to kill his horse. His horse fell out from underneath him, and Posey went with the two boys down south to Bluff and then over towards Allen Canyon, where they rendezvoused his band and continued out into the deserts near Navajo Mountain.
And so they got on out to Westwater and got all the people as fast as they could there to evacuate the residents that had been established which was shade houses or tents or very, very minimal comfort level out there.
It sounds like they felt like they were going to be massacred. If they go back and they say, we need to leave right now, were they fearing retribution?
Well, I don't know what their intent was or what their outcome, what they had thought might happen. But it was just a situation that they were trying to protect their own people and keep their own people involved. And the residents of the area, and then the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was at that time over in southwest Colorado that had the Ute assignment over this direction. There was need to have things happening to the benefit of the Utes because they'd felt that they had their land taken away from them. The grazing area that they used to run their horses and their goats and sheep on was being used by the cattlemen. And so there was some contention there as far as the use of land. You're probably familiar with, if you've studied this at all, of the fact that there was from Blanding going out west into Butler Wash and then down into Combe, and up on the other side there was different skirmishes. There would be contact. And in the bottom of Combe, that's where there was finally the Ute were brought into, and the vehicle, a flatbed truck that was taken in there, loaded, and brought them back into the communities then. Where there was a stockade built here in Blanding that they were actually put in. There was hogans made to house the people were in there, but they were kept in there until the government came and decided what was going to be the end result and took the children out to the boarding schools and then worked with getting the Ute people to where they had land and area out in Allen Canyon. It was used as the post office building through probably 30 years, and then it is still standing, still in use, and it was right next to that on the west where the current city office building is located, where the stockade had the fence around and there was the hogans put inside to where there'd be some place to house the people that was put in there.
So I have read that once the two Ute boys escaped, they were rounded up. The Ute were rounded up in the town of Bluff. Was there any legal basis for rounding up the Ute in town?
Well, the thing that I've handed to you there would give you a good background on what occurred. But as I'd mentioned, they'd come out of the court, up the steps, out of the basement of where the court had been held, and then the skirmishing was taking place down this street north of us out to Westwater. And then the Utes that were out there had all headed out to where they'd find other Utes out in the canyons, out in the Allen Canyon area. The group that was there, also some of them went out like they were headed back over to Colorado where the Utes would be. There was also some Utes that at that time lived in the Montezuma Canyon area out this other direction. And so it wasn't a plan, we know what we're gonna do. It was just almost like it was, what do we do now? Well, here's an idea, let's follow through and see what happened. But the Ute people went from the Westwater area where some were living, down at what they call Murphy's Point, and then there was a skirmish down there where the one deputy sheriff horse that the deputy sheriff was riding was shot. And the bullet went right behind the deputy sheriff into the backbone of the horse, and that was it for that time. And then there was a little Model A being driven down with some individuals in. And the same group of Utes that were down that way that had shot at the deputy horse also shot at that Model A, and the bullet went through the back seat behind where 3 men were sitting. So they, of course, bailed out of the vehicle and out till they see what could take place there. So it was just haphazard, hit and miss type things that was occurring. My father was not here right at that time. He had been here but had moved back. But my mother was still living here in the community. And her father, Dave Black, had been a sheriff in Old Mexico when he had lived in Old Mexico after he was first married. But having been a sheriff down there and being the type individual that was very capable of working with people and getting plans laid out and knowing what to do, when the Posey War issue came up by the group that was the posse for the sheriff's office and whatnot, asked if he would actually take the group that was chasing the Utes, trying to get them rounded up and bringing back in.
So newspapers at the time claimed that it was a total Indian uprising and that people were walking through the streets here with war paint on. Was there any truth to this, or was it minor skirmishes all around?
Well, the things that have been mentioned was just haphazard events that took place that involved the Ute. And then as the sheriff and some of the local people here was able to get organized and get on horseback, as well as those that were traveling in the little old Model A or Model T, maybe it was, down south. But the Utes went that direction, like they might be going into Montezuma, and then they turned and went out into the West Country. And so the next day is when there was another skirmish out in Butler Wash, and there was one Ute boy killed out there as one of the boys that had been involved with this court problem where they'd been starting having problems. But then that's where the posses ended up going, was from Combe Wash. They were able to send a message to the Utes that we want you to come in and let's get this thing over with. And eventually that's what happened, was that the women and children that were out that way, and then some of the Ute men did come in and give themselves up. And then some of the others, of course, kept going. And well, as there was an exchange of bullets there from the Utes and the white settlers, Posey was wounded. And it has been acknowledged by most of the people that were there that it was Dave Black that shot at Posey as he was riding his horse by, and Posey was leaning to where when he got hit in this hip. That's where the bullet wound was in his hip. So he was leaning off on kind of on the other side of the horse as much as he could get. And then there was another effort made the next morning down in the bottom of Combwash, where there was, again, the Utes had camped there and had their fires going, breakfast cooked, and then here come the posse a second time, and they just abandoned. So there was again some exchange of bullets at that point out in the Combwash area. And Dave Black actually was shot at by Posey. He was still able to function there at that point. And then when they rounded everybody up, Posey wasn't part of the group. And as it turned out, he had traveled about 5 or 6 miles to south of there, again just a little side canyon off Combwash, where he had been able to get out, and that's where he stayed. But he was there for a period of time to where eventually he got blood poisoning in the wound. And that was the thing that killed him. If he'd have come in and received medical treatment, why, he wouldn't have died. But he got blood poison in the wound, and that was the thing that eventually took his life.
And I've read that Marshal Jesse Ray Ward found his grave and tried to keep it a secret, but he was dug up. Do you know where his grave is now, or do you have any memories of the Marshal?
Well, he was dug up twice. After they buried him, they wanted to get pictures, and so he was dug up 2 different times, one by the federal people who were involved and one by the local people who were involved, and pictures taken. And I do have a copy of that picture, if I can find it, of his body with those that had dug him up and around in the picture.
Was he ever given a proper burial?
I'll have to see if I can find it. Well, the living conditions of the Utes who were out in Allen Canyon was what I'd term primitive, in that they were still attempting to live as they had done through generations. But there was an effort made to have some farmland developed and utilize the water that was coming down in Allen Canyon and then Cottonwood Wash. In my youth, and not just the fact that I went to school with the youth students from the dormitory, but my father was mining out in that direction, and I've been out and seen the country that the Utes were living in when there was housing, and even had a little school building out there that they were attending at one point. The elementary school here in Blanding, like I've mentioned, had Ute students at each of the grades that were living in the dormitory and then attending school here. I didn't start first grade until 1937, and we had 12 Ute students in our first grade, 6 boys, 6 girls. I've got a picture of those if you'd like to.
I'd love to see it.
See that. But they were easy for me to enjoy and to be around. They didn't just isolate themselves, they blended in and was just part of the class and part of the group. And I had good friends among the Ute students that were there. And it was easy for me later in 1977, when I got a letter from a group that had been organized in White Mesa after the Utes had left Allen Canyon pretty much and come into the community here, and then also down on White Mesa, that the students that I went to school with and then ended up working with down in the community at White Mesa, they're just good people to be around. And they were capable. If it was come time to mine or to farm or to drive truck or whatever it might be, as long as they had the opportunity, they were good workers as well.
And some of the last questions, the sheriff who was involved was shot and killed with his grandson Norris Shumway in 35. And you told me you had some memories of this.
Sheriff Oliver, and this of course was a different issue entirely. It would have been in the mid-30s, 1930s, somewhere in there. And where he residence and where my residence, I lived a half a block from him. And so I was sitting out on the porch of my house, just being there as a young boy, when the truck with a flat bed come down this hill right here and past my house, and they had the two bodies on the back of that truck as it come in. And you know, that makes quite an impression on you when you see something that way.
And you said that was an outlaw from Texas that did that.
I'm sorry?
You said that was an outlaw from Texas that shot and killed.
Well, yes. This was a totally different issue than what we've been discussing with the Ute. It had nothing to do with that. It was dealing with issues over grazing, cattlemen, sheepmen, and the fellow from Texas that was the one that ended up shooting both Sheriff Oliver and his grandson, Nod Shumway, had already had problem in Texas. He'd killed a man there, and so he'd come up into Colorado and then eventually here into San Juan County. And it was herding sheep for Gouldings out at Johns Canyon is where these double murders took place, was at Johns Canyon. That's on this side of San Juan River, up in the little side canyon there by where the goosenecks is at.